Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
Yo, man.
Yo.
Open up, man.
Yo, what you want, man?
My girl just called. Dude.
Say it wasn't you.
Alright. Honey came in and she got me red-handed, creepy with the girl next door. Picture this, we were both caught making love on the bathroom floor. How could I forget that I had given her an extra key? All this time she was standing there, she never took her eyes off me.
Oh, you think I the woman access to your villa? Trespass on a weakness, all of your clean on your pillar. You better watch your back before she turn into a killer. Just review the situation that you caught up in her. To be a true player, you have to know how to play. If she say a night, convince her say a day. Never admit to a word where she say. And if she claim her, you tell her, baby, no way.
Shaggy. He says it wasn't him. This is, I'm betting, one of the first times that Alan Tonelson has ever been introduced on a radio program with Shaggy. It wasn't me. I mean, the guy goes from Paul Revere and the Raiders to Shaggy. My goodness. But in all seriousness, I am very, very pleased to be joined by Alan Tonelson. If you're not familiar with Alan Tonelson, he's one of the best writers when it comes to economics and politics that's out there. He is somebody I consider to be a trade expert. He's the founder of RealityChek, which is a wonderful blog which covers economics, national security, technology, and more. And he's been an advisor on trade issues to both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Alan, it's great to have you back on the program. Thanks for joining me.
Frank, it's great to be here, although I have to say I'd probably prefer Paul Revere.
I bet.
Just right. For the record, I just had to make that completely clear and okay. So
understandable. A lot that I want to go over with you in a relatively short amount of time. So over the weekend, there were politicians, both Democrat and Republican, and newspaper editorial boards, both liberal and conservative, all having kittens over the prospect of tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. Senator Schumer came out and said, no, this is going to cost the average American about $1,200 a year. Now, the kerfuffle over the tariffs appears to have lasted about a day because as of yesterday, now the president says that he's worked out a deal with the president of Mexico and other world leaders to get something that he wants in exchange for not implementing the tariffs. Before we get to the strategic aspect of this, which I feel like is a little bit of a different ballgame than the economic aspect of this.
Right, exactly.
Why are tariffs good? Because if they're good, why would we hear so many people from across the political spectrum all talking about how dangerous they are and how they're going to not only lead American consumers to pay higher prices, but they're going to hurt American exporters because of retaliatory tariffs from other countries? Give me your overall thought on that, Alan.
Frank, if I had to single out one, well, actually, I would single out two reasons, if that makes sense grammatically. The first reason is that so many of the think tanks, most of which are headquartered here in the Washington, D.C. area, but there are some up in New York City too and all around the country, but most of these think tanks, which have, until the Trump administrations, have had tremendous influence over what you would call lead opinion concerning trade policy and public policy generally speaking, these think tanks are funded heavily by what I call the corporate offshoring lobby. These are not only U.S.-owned multinational companies, but foreign-owned multinational companies, too, in addition to foreign governments, which have a very enormous vested stake in keeping U.S. trade policy in exactly the same condition that it was before President Trump's first administration. And essentially, those U.S.-owned multinational companies have made enormous amounts of money sending U.S. production and jobs overseas, not necessarily to, in fact, very often not to serve overseas markets, to serve overseas customers, but to send products right back to the United States. It's been extremely profitable, and foreign governments and foreign companies that once again make enormous amounts of money, and in fact, whose economies, when we're talking about foreign governments, depend heavily on exporting to the United States. And these corporate and foreign government interests fund think tanks like it's absolutely extraordinary the extent. And unfortunately, journalists, both TV and print and online, etc., they wind up frequently parroting this offshoring line that's being pushed by these think tanks, and they all wind up writing how terrible tariffs are, how we're going to face what I like to call Tariff-mageddon if they're imposed in any circumstance, whatever. But there's another reason, too, and it's also quite important, and that is that it's what so many of not only them, but so many of us learned in school, at least if we were actually paying attention, and that is that when the United States imposed wide-ranging tariffs on the rest of the world in 1930, that essentially caused or made much worse the Great Depression of the 1930s, which led to the rise of fascism all around the world and therefore World War II. And therefore, tariffs are horrible. We have to avoid them at all costs. Right. And that's, again, what so many of us learned in high school, in college, etc., and it is stuck with people. It's really become part of what you might call the national economic narrative. Right. It's very deeply ingrained, and unfortunately, journalists, in particular, have not recognized that times have changed quite dramatically over the past, roughly 7 or 8 decades we're talking about, after all.
At 33 minutes after the hour, this is The Other Side of Midnight. My guest is Alan Tonelson. We're talking tariffs. Your point about what we learned about the Great Depression and World War II is right on the money. I think that the overwhelming majority of this audience, who I consider to be a pretty well-informed audience, the only things they could tell you about either Smoot or Hawley is that they were responsible for a tariff program that led the United States to sink deeper into the Depression. But the truth is, and the history is a little bit more nuanced, right?
Exactly. There were so many problems that were accumulating in the world economy in the 1920s, a lot of which were, in fact, the fault of the United States, but not because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. That certainly triggered a series of events all around the world, especially retaliatory tariffs from most U.S. trading partners, or I should say most major U.S. trading partners. But again, the world economy had become so troubled and so unbalanced by the late 1920s that something like this was actually bound to happen. And in fact, one one incredibly important difference between the global circumstances of the 1920s and on to 1930 and the global circumstances that we faced recently is that back in the 1920s and the early 1930s, the United States essentially played the role that China has been playing recently. It's been the big global trade surplus country. It's the country that had wound up exporting much more to the rest of the world than it had been taking in, and that was responsible, again, for so many of those international economic troubles that ultimately led to the Great Depression and wound up making sure that it stayed great, unfortunately, for a long, long time. Today, the circumstances are almost exactly the reverse. China's the big problem, and if somebody, meaning Washington, since we still are the world's largest economy, in fact, the world's importer of last resort, if somebody doesn't do something about this, we may be heading for another economic crash in the not-too-distant future.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Here at the Almond Joy Factory, where tropical vibes abound, we use soft, fresh-tasting coconut.
The crunchiest almonds and delicious chocolate candy.
Ah, but do you know what our most important ingredient is? Sometimes you feel like a nut.
Sometimes you don't.
Almond Joy's got nuts and something even way better than that. Yes, Almond Joy is made with almonds and joy.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
This episode is brought to you by GMC. When you have 4 new tires, every drive feels fresh. Right now, buy 3 select tires and get 1 for just $1 during the GMC Certified Service Fresh Start Tire Event. Visit gmc.com/service offers or see dealer for full details. At participating U.S. GM dealers only. Highest or equal value tire will be $1. Offer ends 5/31/2025. Not available with other offers.
Well, let's sincerely hope that's not the case.
Sure.
Alan Tonelson is my guest. You can read him by searching out RealityChek, a terrific blog that really delves in depth into these issues and a lot of other issues that we might not be getting on the program. Now, I pointed out on social media, and I think I might have said it on the radio as well, the substantial trade deficit that the United States enjoys, or maybe enjoys is not the right word, as compared to other countries. And I said, look, people are always warning about a trade war, including the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal and others, that we're in a trade war, as evidenced by this massive trade deficit, but the United States is losing. Immediately, I was deluged with emails, with correspondence, essentially saying that trade deficits don't matter. It's not as if that's an indication, or at least not a proper indication, of a country's wealth and a country's prosperity. If you're just tuning in, we're talking with the one and only Alan Tonelson. Alan, from your perspective, what do trade deficits actually portend for economies?
Well, certainly, I'd have to point out that if trade deficits were so inconsequential, then why do so few countries around the world want to run them? There's no. I mean, now it's certainly true that the rest of the world could be wrong about this, but I really doubt that. The fact is that trade deficits wind up reducing growth in this country, at least the way that that standard economics actually calculates growth. And there's no doubt that it has hollowed out the U.S. manufacturing base. And when a country doesn't have adequate manufacturing, when it doesn't produce enough things, what we found out is that it has to create prosperity, or at least the appearance of prosperity for its own citizens in some other way. And that usually winds up in these countries encouraging the enormous accumulation of debt. And that's what we saw, by the way, in the years running up to the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, when you had U.S. trade deficits just skyrocketing. That meant that American citizens and wage earners were essentially deprived of the kinds of earning opportunities that they needed to be able to maintain the living standards that they had quite rightly grown accustomed to. And the only way that those living standards could be propped up was for Washington to encourage the creation of these massive debts that, as we found out, I mean, that story didn't end well, either for the United States or the rest of the world. And the problem with running up these enormous deficits and therefore weakening your national productive capacities, again, it's relying on debt-fueled growth that almost inevitably winds up being a massive bubble that's going to burst with very disastrous consequences.
Yeah. All right. Now, yesterday, obviously, President Trump made a great deal of news when he announced that the Mexican tariffs were going to be put on pause in exchange for certain key concessions from the Mexican government, which were the sort of things that he's been interested in doing. For the uninitiated, for people that maybe just saw a headline, why exactly are these tariffs being paused, and what is the United States getting in exchange for pausing them?
When we're talking about Mexico and Colombia in particular, the tariffs are being paused because both governments have essentially backed down, or at least promised to back away from policies that they began to put into effect that President Trump rightly objected to and that all Americans ought to rightly object to. In the case of Mexico, they were doing an absolutely terrible job of controlling not only their own northern border, which is, of course, America's southern border, but their own southern border with the countries of Central America. And as a result, the migration of Central American migrants northward through Mexico to the United States had once again been threatening to reach very high levels, and President Trump rightly said, Mexico, you've got to put a stop at this. And at first, Mexico hemmed and hawed, and finally, the government of President Sheinbaum clearly backed down, because Mexico depends, for whatever level of prosperity it's managed to create for its own people, it relies much more heavily on access to the United States market than vice versa. And President Trump knew this, and President Sheinbaum knew this. When it comes to Colombia, you had Colombia's government initially refusing to accept U.S. deportation flights of illegal aliens. And, of course, we know that this first phase of President Trump's deportation policies has focused on very dangerous criminal illegal aliens. Now, I can kind of understand why Colombia didn't want to take them back, but I can certainly also understand why President Trump wanted to get rid of them. And frankly, they're Colombia's problem, not ours. And of course, because the United States also holds such massive leverage over Colombia's economy, its president backed down too. So President Trump has also imposed 25% tariffs on Canada for immigration and also drug control related reasons. And of course, drug controls played a large part in that Mexican tariff decision. And with China, it was also related to drugs, because China winds up sending lots of not only the chemical precursors for fentanyl and various other opioids to the Mexican cartels, it also winds up sending the manufacturing gear needed to make them. And you know where that fentanyl winds up. And President Trump said, no more of this. And if it doesn't stop quickly, those tariffs on China are going to increase.
Yeah.
China has not backed down yet, but I think we're going to see some kind of a significant effort by Beijing to basically put a halt to this practice. And if China doesn't, it's going to be tariffed higher.
Speaking of China, a lot of attention has been paid to what's going on with TikTok. Now, Congress passed this legislation in a bipartisan manner to force TikTok to sell to an American company. The president signed this, and then the Supreme Court upheld the president's decision to sign this bill. President Trump put a pause on that as well, even though 4 years ago he was in favor of buying TikTok.
Right.
Now, President Trump signed an executive order establishing a sovereign wealth fund that he actually says could buy TikTok. Where do you see that, Alan? Is that real, or is that just bluster?
I don't see why the creation of a sovereign wealth fund would help solve the TikTok problem that so many Americans are, of course, rightly concerned about. The problem is the Chinese don't want to sell it. And the Chinese don't want to sell it because it's such an actual and potentially important propaganda tool for them. And I don't see why they would sell TikTok more readily to a sovereign wealth fund than to, let's say, some consortium of U.S. technology companies. But actually, my own view on TikTok and what we ought to do with it, it's a little different from that of really either side of this debate. I'm a free speech guy, and I think that actually TikTok ought to remain in Chinese hands, that it shouldn't be censored, it shouldn't be banned, but we need transparency on everything that TikTok broadcasts or puts online. There should be a big message crawling across the bottom of that post that says this company or this entity, because it's not really a company, because it's certainly not a company the way that we in Western capitalist countries define that term. This company is run by the Chinese Communist Party. And that should be run continuously like some TV crawl over and over again. And I think that should be the case for other foreign government news and media organizations that are allowed to operate here too. For example, the British Broadcasting Company. That's basically run by the British government. Now, I would lump London and Beijing into the same category, but they're both foreign government-owned media. They both reflect those governments' viewpoints, to a certain extent, of course, entirely regarding TikTok. And I think that the best way to counter their influence and to remain true to America's free speech traditions is transparency. That wasn't the course that Congress chose, and I think here President Trump has really got to follow the law.
It's going to be a very interesting situation going forward. And if people have questions, by the way, they can give me a call, 646-720-0635. If they call in while Alan's on, he actually has some expertise. Maybe he can actually answer the question, but I will allow you to comment without free rein, without being challenged to...
With free rein.
With free rein, and without being challenged in any intellectually provocative manner. Folks can call 646-720-0635. You got TikTok, you got China, and that leads, at least in part, to the situation regarding social media, media technology, and AI. You have a lot of concerns about AI replacing humans in fields related from the legal profession to radio, you name it, everything in between. And a lot of these concerns about AI accelerated with rocket fuel with the revolution of this DeepSeek, a Chinese generative AI model. A lot of people have the same concern about this Chinese company that they do about TikTok in terms of data collection and things like that. Where are we with AI? Is AI the new space race? And is this DeepSeek, is this China's Sputnik moment?
Frank, I'm not sure that anyone can comment definitively about DeepSeek's capabilities. We have the Chinese government. We have DeepSeek's word. DeepSeek, like every business entity in China, is ultimately responsible to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is not one of the world's great truth telling organizations. So it's not clear to me what exactly DeepSeek can do and what kinds of an advance it might represent over previous artificial intelligence technology, if any advance whatever. But I think we would be wise to err on the side of caution. And I think that we have to be worried about Chinese progress in artificial intelligence, generally speaking, mainly because it poses such an extraordinary potential national security threat. I think it is crystal clear to every thinking person that artificial intelligence technology is going to be the key to weapon systems for generations to come. And the country with the best AI technology is going to have a massive advantage on the battlefield. And certainly we want the United States to remain comfortably in the lead. And what worries me about the possibility that DeepSeek does represent a major advance is that I think that Chinese progress could have been controlled a lot more effectively had U.S. export controls on various kinds of artificial intelligence-related hardware and software been more effective, meaning had they been imposed much, much earlier and had they been imposed in a much more sweeping manner.
All right.
And in this case, we had this gradual escalation that gave the Chinese plenty of opportunity to adapt.
Alan Tonelson, we're going to have to end it there. I very much appreciate the time and such a comprehensive conversation.
Well, Frank, thank you as always for the opportunity and hope that we can resume soon.
No doubt about it. All right, 646-720-0635. If you want to comment, 646-720-0635. Regardless of your desire to comment, please be sure to check out Alan Tonelson's blog. You can either Google Alan Tonelson or just Google RealityChek, and it comes right up. This is The Other Side of Midnight. Straight ahead.